Welcome. And thank you all so much for coming today to this session at MPI entitled the New National Integration Plan, Making the Most of a Historic Opportunity. My name's Michael Fix, and I'm the president of the Migration Policy Institute. And I want to tell you that I have been in this field of immigrant integration for many years. And I just want to say how extremely pleased MPI and the National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy are to host this event on what is clearly a milestone report in immigrant integration. It is, to my eye, the most far-ranging report on this under-examined issue that has yet to be seen, and the Domestic Policy Council, USCIS, the agencies that contributed to it, the stakeholders that contributed to it, are really to be heartily congratulated. As everybody in this room knows, starting with the 1965 Immigration Act, the U.S. has really evolved one of the most generous set of immigration policies in the world. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but we house 20% of the world's immigrants. 1 in 7 Americans today is foreign-born, and 25% of Americans has a foreign-born parent. But our immigrant integration policies have been more diffuse. They've often been underfunded. They've frequently been unaligned. And that brings us to today. And so here I think we should just do a little definitional work. What do we mean by integration? Well, the task force report is to be congratulated for not going deeply into these definitional weeds. But just for the purposes of our conversation today, we'll just say that integration can mean increasing newcomers' life chances to get what we value in society, to increase social acceptance, and to reduce the distance between native and immigrant groups by means of a two-way process that changes both the newcomer and the receiving community. So I've been involved in the process of the National Academy of Sciences, a committee on the integration of immigrants into American society, and that has brought me to the question, do we need an immigrant integration policy in the United States? How are immigrants doing? And here I would only say that when you look at this issue from a very high altitude, we know that immigrants in America today are proceeding as they have historically. That is to say, with substantial progress being made between the first generation that's born abroad and the second generation that's born in the United States. But unfortunately, we still see reasons for concern. There are 8 million or so legal permanent residents who are eligible to naturalize who have not done so. There are almost 1 in 10 students in America's schools are English language learners. And there are about 1.5 to 2 million foreign-born college graduates who are either unemployed or underemployed, representing a wide array of brain waste. So in a nutshell, I think we need this report. We need it now. We need the very important processes that it has set in motion, and we are very grateful to be able to hear about it. And so with that, let me introduce our panel. We'll hear first this morning from Ceclia Munoz, known to you all. She was the co-director with USCIS's Leon Rodriguez of the White House Task Force that brought this report together by Washington standards in the most amazing, blazing speed. As you know, she's the president's domestic policy advisor. She's the director of the Domestic Policy Council. She's a former senior vice president at National Council of La Raza, and she's the winner of many prestigious awards, including the MacArthur Genius Award, obviously one of the best bets that foundation has ever made. Cecilia, you should know, will have to leave promptly at 2 o'clock to return to the White House, but we are extremely fortunate that Felicia Escobar, Special Assistant to the President for Immigration Policy at the Domestic Policy Council, will be able to take her place for the balance of the session. Felicia previously worked for Colorado Senator Ken Salazar. Then following Cecilia, we'll get comments from the acclaimed director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, Ava Malona, Ava is co-chair of the National Partnership for New Americans, and she was co-chair of the Massachusetts Governor's Advisory Council on Immigrants, which was in some very important ways perhaps a forerunner of this task force that we'll hear about today. And then we'll conclude by hearing from Margie McHugh, the director of MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, and you should know the architect of our web presence on the White House Task Force report and the process that's flowing from it, and that you will have to visit if you have not already. Prior to joining MPI, Margie was the executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition in New York. We'll then take questions. We're being live streamed, and there will be a video and audio recording of this, so please say your name when you ask a question, and then we'll close promptly at 2:45. So with that, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you to MPI for the invitation. And to Margie for your leadership on this issue. You all have been laboring in these vineyards for a very long time, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about this, especially with you and with Ava. And I would be remiss if I didn't really give a shout out to Felicia, whose labor of love this really is. While I have the honor of co-chairing this effort with Leon Rodriguez, the director of USCIS, you all know Washington well enough to know that he and I have very vast portfolios and are able to do what we do, especially in leadership of efforts like this, only because there are extremely brilliant and hardworking people working with us every day, and nobody more so than Felicia, who is a real hero on this effort, as well as many other things that we do on immigration. So I'm grateful to her and glad that she's here to be able to engage in a more direct conversation, because the fact of the matter is she knows this backwards and forwards more than anybody else, including me. So this is, as Michael says, this is an incredibly important effort, because as a nation of immigrants, we actually do quite well on the question of integration, in part because of how our immigration system is designed, in that the vast majority of people who come to the United States are sponsored or petitioned for either by family members or by employers. So we get a lot of integration just because of how newcomers enter the United States. What the president did was essentially challenge his team when he did his executive actions to be thinking through much more carefully than we already had been. And in fact, this is an effort we've been engaged in for 6 years. What would it mean if we were trying, if we were being deliberate, and if we were engaging really the whole federal architecture and infrastructure in the question of integration? How much better could we do? How much more could we do? And what the task force is really about is making sure that as a federal government, we're being thoughtful and deliberate about this effort, and really using the resources that we have in a way which builds it into the work, into the architecture, and even into the DNA of federal agencies. This is obviously something that USCIS should be thinking about. They are the agency which actually naturalizes people, after all. But if it begins and ends with USCIS, then we haven't fully done our job. So the creation of the task force was a way of institutionalizing this notion that this is actually a job for the federal government as federal government, and that we should be thoughtful about ways that we build it in. And we looked at really 3 pillars that you see outlined in the report: civic integration, economic integration, linguistic integration. And that's really, they have been our focus for 6 years. But what we've done is essentially use the task force as a moment to really concentrate the agency's attention, and to work on a way of institutionalizing their efforts, so that we take advantage of opportunities and of work that is already underway, and really turbocharge it all across the federal government. So among the things that we hope to accomplish, in some ways the obvious thing, but tremendously important thing, is to do even more and even better than we already do with respect to help people become citizens. USCIS is undergoing a process of modernization, which you will be seeing additional signs of under Director Rodriguez's really extraordinary leadership. And so they're looking at ways to, for example, streamline the process by which people pay for their citizenship applications. So you heard that the application fee, by the end of the year, you'll be able to use a credit card for. You've heard, hopefully, if you've seen the report, that we will be lifting up the stories of naturalized citizens, that the agency is going to be using tools that it has to make people aware of the opportunity to naturalize. So, for example, when you renew your green card, you pay a fee to the agency. You go through a bureaucratic process. In many cases, the people who are renewing green cards, in fact, in most cases, people who are renewing green cards are actually likely to be eligible to become citizens. We're going to take advantage of that opportunity and make sure that they know that they're eligible, and see if we can improve the conversation that we as the federal government have with the people who are our clients and constituents and customers in that way. So these are part of an effort that's aimed at both modernizing the agency, but making sure that we're in conversation with people who are immigrants to the United States to make sure that we are as welcoming as possible and make the process as accessible as possible. And we're very excited about both the leadership and the energy that's in place at USCIS to make that happen. But in some ways, the meat of this report is also about what the rest of the federal architecture is going to be doing. And while it is perhaps the kind of least sexy work that goes on in the federal government, the notion of interagency task forces and those kinds of meetings, it's also very much where the rubber meets the road. So when you have folks in the infrastructure of the Department of Education and the Department of Labor and the Small Business Administration and the other federal agencies really digging through and thinking through, where are the places that we intersect with immigrants? What do we do well? What are we not doing well? Where are there opportunities that we are availing ourselves of successfully? And what are the opportunities that we've not yet availed ourselves of in the programs that we administer and in the laws that we're implementing? The Workforce Investment Act is a great example where the Department of Labor and the Department of Education have new sets of tools under a new law and some architecture that they are building under a new law and a reform. So what this interagency group, what this task force allows us to do is to think through and to frankly set goals and deliverables and hold ourselves accountable to making sure that as that law gets implemented by the agencies with those responsibilities, that this piece of the work, that connecting with immigrants, connecting with new Americans, is part of what they do, and that they are engaging deliberately in making sure that as we measure our success and helping people get successfully into the workforce or advance their position in the workforce, that we're looking at these populations specifically, and measuring whether or not we're making a difference with these populations in the way that we do with other populations. Another example is one of our partners in the task force is the Corporation for National Community Service. Again, the exercise is to think through what opportunities do we have, what tools are we using. Part of the way that this administration is advancing the service agenda is looking at the agencies and seeing where we can expand opportunities for service within what the federal government already does. And what CNCS came up with was both an effort to engage newcomers themselves in serving their communities, but also in an effort with HHS and the Office of Refugee Resettlement to be recruiting volunteers to work with local communities to help with the process, especially of integration with refugees. So it's both service aimed at the integration process, but service also aimed at making sure that new Americans are part of the infrastructure, part of the whole process of serving your neighbors and serving your communities. The Small Business Administration, another example, we all know about in the immigrants' rights world and talk about how entrepreneurial immigrants are, how likely they are to be starting small business, how much that means both to local economies as well as to our economy as a nation. So the Small Business Administration, under the really extraordinary leadership of Maria Contreras Sui, who is an immigrant herself, has been thinking about how do they use the tools they have to make sure they're reaching out deliberately to populations of new Americans, to make sure they have the tools that they need to access credit, to start small businesses, to know how to navigate through that process. And so again, this is an example of trying to build this piece into the general day-to-day work that the agencies do in serving the American people, but also importantly, setting metrics, setting benchmarks, setting timelines, and making sure that we're meeting them. What that essentially means and what we hope to accomplish is to make sure that we build this really into the DNA of the federal bureaucracy, of the agencies that serve the country and the American people across the federal government, right? So this is both about, at a leadership level, making sure that we continue this conversation about what we're going to be doing, what kind of goals and benchmarks we're going to set, but much more importantly, to make sure that the folks who are going to be continuing this work when political appointees like me and Felicia are no longer in the roles that we're in, that thinking and that connection to these communities is built into what those agencies do and think about and work on every single day. That's really the goal. And that is how this kind of philosophy and this notion of making sure that we are, that the federal government is the kind of partner that it should be in the effort to be a welcoming community writ large, in the way that so many local governments and local communities are engaging in this welcoming communities movement. The way we do that permanently is to make sure that we build it in an effective way now. So that's really what this task force is setting out to do. It is part of what accounts for the speed with which we did this report. Michael is right that in federal government terms, this was lightning speed. The other reason for the lightning speed is because the president gave us a timeline. And when you get a presidential memorandum directive like that, you tend to want to meet that timeline. Because he is eager for what we can accomplish. He's eager for outcomes. He's very eager to make sure that we're moving the needle for people. And this is the sort of, when you think about it, that most American of jobs in this nation of immigrants is making sure that the federal government is doing its part, and also doing the best that we can to lift up efforts in states, in local governments, encouraging mayors and county executives and other community leaders to take up this challenge and do this work as well. We have to make sure we do our part well, but we also have the convening capacity of the White House and the voice of the president as a tool to make sure that others are taking this job on as well. And we have great, great examples to follow in the welcoming communities movement. And you will see that handiwork and the work that many of you in this room have been doing very much reflected in the task force's work and the task force's report. So I thank all of you for all of that. I think we have time maybe for a couple questions if folks want to do that. And really just we so appreciate the focus and the partnership. We did a lot of consultation as we were preparing this report. We heard from a lot of people around the country, and I hope you see your voices also reflected in the work that we did. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So what do we need to know?
Here we have a question.
Oh, hi. I'm Gene Sofer. I work for the National Council of State Directors of Adult Education, and I also represent the National Association of RSVP Directors. So I have a comment and a suggestion. But the comment is about what the report doesn't seem to do about adult ed, which is, given your comments about the existing infrastructure and DNA, the report does not appear to build on the existing national adult ed infrastructure in terms of both providing civic integration and linguistic integration. And I just wondered if you might talk a little bit about why not, or if I'm just wrong in the way I read the report. And the other is a suggestion that as you look at how service can help in this, you look at the Retired Senior Volunteer Program, which is also administered by the corporation and involves volunteers 55 years and older, like me. Thank you.
Thank you. So you shouldn't read the report as like the exhaustive, comprehensive list of sort of everything that the federal government is going to do. What you see are a set of recommendations which are really guideposts and guidelines for how, and examples of how the agencies are engaging this work. I think the adult ed example is, I mean, it is an obvious place where we are in fact deeply engaged with immigrant communities. And those pieces of work are ongoing and will continue. But the real goal here is to make sure that up and down the food chain, not just at the Department of Education, but really across the domestic agencies that the Domestic Policy Council works with, that this is both how we do our thinking, how we do our planning, and it's incorporated in the benchmarks that we set for ourselves. You bet. You bet. Let's go here and then there.
Thanks. I'm Victoria Benner with the National Council of La Raza. Hi. Thank you, and of course, Felicia, for all of your work in putting this together. We know so much thought went into this, and pulling anything together of this scale is immensely difficult, and we appreciate that. We also know that our affiliates, as you know too, are ready to help be local partners on the ground in implementing the recommendations you both put forward. They were particularly interested in the Welcoming Communities Challenge, especially as an opportunity to pull together civic, linguistic, and economic integration into thing like an integration zone, as Charles likes to talk about. I was hoping that you could maybe talk more about, how you saw this unfolding.
Felicia is an NCLR alum too.
Yes.
So this is actually, I think, a really exciting piece of the work, and this is something that we do on a number of priorities that the President has put forward. So to give you an example of a challenge that is already well underway, the federal government is deeply engaged in reducing homelessness among veterans, and are actually, homelessness among veterans is down over 40% as a result of a whole bunch of really good things that are happening. But one of those good things is that the First Lady issued a challenge that literally hundreds of mayors have taken up, and we provided tools. They're providing leadership, and so we essentially have a partnership that is focused on some very specific things which are helping drive this rate of homelessness down. So that's kind of the model. We're using that model similarly on the My Brother's Keeper project, and a whole range of other things. So that's the model that we're seeking to apply here, which is, and in this case, we had something to build off of, which is the work that the Welcoming Communities movement has been doing already, that there are obviously already places that have taken this on and are doing it well. And we think one of the things we can contribute is by issuing a challenge is to make sure that we draw others into this movement, folks that may not have thought about it before. And we can apply the same kinds of principles where we can provide expertise, we can provide partnership, we can also provide avenues to peer learning from other communities that are already doing this well. And among the beauties of this model is that it means that local leaders can build coalitions that work for whatever the particular circumstances of that community are. And that we, by sort of lifting it up, we both help bring more people into the movement, but help give folks the tools to make sure that their movements are successful. So we're hoping that this is a way of really extending dramatically the really good work that's been going on for some time.
Take the prerogative of the chair, Cecilia, and ask you one question. It's a question I've asked you any number of times, but now that you've been through this amazing experience, what do you think about the notion now of institutionalizing something like the task force in a White House office? Does it make more or less sense to you? Does it?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's always the hard part, right? As both resources, but also, to be honest, there are any one of a number of really great things to accomplish as a policy matter and as good governance that people would love to see institutionalized in offices of the White House. And this is a White House, and inevitably, when such an office gets created, and sometimes they've gotten created by statute, for example, the Office of National AIDS Policy is part of the Domestic Policy Council that was created actually by Congress. The people who run those offices inevitably end up getting called czars of various things, and we are very, I don't know what the right way to frame it is, but we're trying to move away from czars and more towards good governance across the board, right? So you shouldn't need to have a czar on an issue in order to make sure that the federal government is doing its part and doing its job. It's, as I said, it's much less sexy to have an interagency effort, but the fact of the matter is it's the best way to institutionalize the work. And you essentially have the equivalent by having a point person in the White House, in this case the Domestic Policy Council, in this case me, and through me really Felicia, driving the work of the agencies every day and making sure that the work gets done. So that's essentially what a White House office provides. And frankly, it's the Domestic Policy Council's job on domestic issues. So I understand the impetus, and as an advocate, as a former advocate, I'd be coming at us to do the same thing. But the fact of the matter is that somebody has to think about governance. My job is to make sure that we do this well and that the work keeps going even after I'm no longer in this job. And that's what we're seeking to accomplish here. I think we are too. But thank you all very much. This is tremendously important work, and we're really grateful for MPI's partnership.
And Cecilia, we are thrilled. There were lots of ways you and Felicia could have spent your idle hours in the White House, and that you spent it on the issue of immigrant integration is hugely important. Thank you.
Thank you very much.